The sentence means Mr. Trump avoids prison or a fine, but it formalises his status as the first US president to be a convicted felon 10 days before he returns to the White House. His lawyers argued unsuccessfully for presidential immunity after he was found guilty of falsifying business records to cover up a sex scandal. Justice Juan Merchan said the unconditional discharge was the only lawful sentence without encroaching upon the highest office in the land. Donald Trump and his defence lawyer said they'll appeal the ruling, arguing that the case should be dismissed.
This has been a very terrible experience. I think it's been a tremendous setback for New York and the New York court system. It's been a political witch hunt. It was done to damage my reputation so that I'd lose the election, and obviously that didn't work. And the people of our country got to see this firsthand because they watched the case in your courtroom. They got to see this firsthand, and then they voted, and I won and got the largest number of votes by far of any Republican candidate in history.
The prosecution said Donald Trump had shown no remorse for his actions.
Instead of preserving, protecting, and defending our constitutionally established system of criminal justice, the defendant, the once and future President of the United States, has engaged in a coordinated campaign to undermine its legitimacy. Far from expressing any kind of remorse for his criminal conduct, the defendant has purposefully bred disdain for our judicial institutions and the rule of law. Put simply, this defendant has caused enduring damage to public perception of the criminal justice system and has placed officers of the court in harm's way.
Our correspondent, Neda Tawfiq, sent this report from New York.
Donald Trump appeared virtually on a monitor at the defense table. He was sentenced to unconditional discharge on all 34 criminal counts. That is the most lenient sentence possible and means that his guilty verdict goes on his record, that the case is concluded, but that he faces no punishment, no jail, no probation, not even a fine. Judge Juan Merchan limited his remarks to explaining his decision, saying it was the only lawful sentence he could impose that wouldn't encroach on Trump's imminent role as president. He then wished the president-elect Godspeed as he assumes his second term. The sentencing here at Manhattan's criminal court marks the culmination of an historic criminal trial, the first one ever brought against a sitting or former president. Because it's a state case and one with a verdict, Donald Trump could not get it stopped like the other criminal cases against him. Trump says he plans to appeal. He spoke in court and repeated his claims that the case was politically motivated. In the end, though, enough voters didn't feel it was disqualifying, and he will be sworn in as president on January 20th.
Now let's talk about some of the issues raised by today's developments. We're joined now by former US prosecutor Neama Rahmani. Thanks for being with us on BBC News.
Thanks for having me.
This unconditional discharge, many people won't have heard of that before. How often is it handed down at a sentence hearing?
It's very uncommon, but this is not an ordinary case. An unconditional discharge means that there was no substantive punishment at all. No incarceration, no home confinement, no fine, not even probation, because practically it does not make sense to fine or put a former president or current president-elect on probation because he can just thumb his nose at the judicial system and there's no recourse if he doesn't comply.
Given that the conviction still stands, what does this mean for Donald Trump? He is about to become president. Is he going to be limited in any way?
No, the Constitution places no limits on a convicted felon being president. Really, the only requirements are that you be 35 years of age and be born in the United States. Theoretically, someone could be a convicted felon and even in prison and still be the president. Of course, it does tarnish his reputation, and that's why the president's defense team wanted to appeal this case before this conviction was finalized. But now that it has been entered into a judgment, he'll have to appeal like any other criminal defendant and wait months for the appellate courts to sort through these issues.
And so talk to us a little bit about what will be involved in that process, that appeal process.
There'll be 3 stages of appeals. The first will be the appellate division of the Supreme Court in New York, and then there will be an appeal to the New York Court of Appeal, which is the state's highest court. And of course, this case may well end up before the U.S. Supreme Court again, because we're talking about federal constitutional issues when it comes to presidential immunity. And we know that the president has a receptive audience there because at least 4 of the justices were willing to grant that emergency appeal, which would have been extraordinary. The Supreme Court typically doesn't hear interlocutory appeals like that until a conviction is finalized. So the president will have 3 chances to get this conviction overturned on appeal.
We heard from President-elect Trump that he had tried to use that Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity. Will it likely have any impact on the appeal process as you've outlined there?
I think so. That is by far and away the strongest argument that the president has, because a different majority of the Supreme Court, 6-3, ruled last summer that the president's immunity is very broad. Anything that's arguably an official act is subject to immunity. And even evidence of official acts can't come into the trial. And the president is arguing, of course, that his tweets about Michael Cohen, his communications with Hope Hicks and other officials in the White House, they were introduced as evidence in that hush money trial, and that was unconstitutional. So those appellate courts, including the Supreme Court, are going to have to weigh those arguments.
So a long road still to run on this, it sounds. Neama Rahmani, former US prosecutor, thank you very much for joining us on that.